Are you sure about this?
Yes, you'll be fine. I'm gonna stop 6 inches in front of you.
That is not 6 inches.
Okay, 6 inches. Stop being so nervous. You're messing up my vibe.
You've done this before?
No.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Okay, stop. Okay, brake. Okay, brake. Oh, I'm sorry. His brakes. I improvised. Oh, that's a lot of blood. That's a lot of blood. I gotta go get a cup. Ryan!
I like hitting Josh with cars. Real ones, fake ones, real fake ones. Doesn't matter.
Maybe a little too much.
What?
You like it a little too much.
You don't really interject anymore. I feel like let's stick with that. Anyway, hitting Josh with cars. We did a car hit in the first year of Film Riot 2. It doesn't look too bad still, but it definitely is dated, so we decided to give it another go. When we shot that old scene, we kind of did it all in one take. We had the camera locked down, had the cars pass by, Josh's performance, then popped it off the tripod and ran over to Josh. So in this shot, we wanted to do it all in one take as well. The main performance, which then led to Josh acting out getting hit, moving out of frame. Then I had Justin drive in and back out for us to use the car coming in. Then I whipped to the garage where Josh would go, and on that whip, Justin got back into position so I could pan back over to him for the rest. After that, we can easily piece things together by cutting the bits together with those whip pans. But Josh flying toward and hitting the door will be all digital, which means we need a digital model of Josh, one that we plan to pull from a scan. We've scanned things before using images, iPhones, and so on, but it's a bit frustrating at times, so we decided to simplify this in a certain way. We bought a Lazy Susan off of Amazon, then a piece of wood to go on top of that for Josh to stand on, and then grabbed some monopods to support his arms so that he could stay perfectly still. Then we just spun him around. Now we can keep him and the camera in the same position and keep a perfectly flat light throughout.
We're riding around this wagon wheel. She took me for a spin. We're riding around this carousel, getting dizzy till we're sick.
For how we planned to piece this scan together, we just needed two shots, one of Josh's full body and one of his face much closer in for detail. If we needed more detail than that, we could get a lot more shots, but this was enough for our purposes here. Now with our shots for the scan, we'll bring them into our photogrammetry software of choice. In our case, we're gonna be using PhotoCatch, but other apps like Reality Capture or Polycam would work just fine as well. PhotoCatch and Polycam actually both use the same object capture API, so the results between those two should be pretty similar. We'll export our scans and bring them into Blender for some cleanup. We'll start with the body scan, making sure that the scale of the model makes sense and is rotated correctly. We'll want to remove unnecessary parts like the post that Josh is resting his hands on and the platform. Of course, this leaves us with some empty holes in our mesh. We'll just smooth those edges and fill them with new faces. Each time you do this, you'll want to UV unwrap the new face and use the texture paint tool to make a seamless blend. Since we deleted some big chunks from the scan, there's plenty of unused areas in the texture map that we can repurpose for these new faces. You can see that some areas like the hands are kind of mushy and not very detailed, but for this shot, that won't really matter. If we were using this model for a close-up, we might delete the hands altogether and use a more detailed model instead, but again, this should work just fine for what we're doing. Once the body model is cleaned up, we'll bring in the head scan and clean the geometry using the sculpting tool. We realized later on that there wasn't any coverage on the top of Josh's head, so we'll just have to use some filling and painting techniques there as well. It's helpful to switch to a flat shaded view for anything texture related and use the studio lighting mode for sculpting. Once that's cleaned up, we'll delete the low quality head from the body scan, replace it with the high quality one, and merge them into one object. It's also a good idea to put the final mesh into its own collection so we can easily import it into another file later on. Now we can rig our model and set up our ragdoll. To start, we're going to create a basic human meta rig and align the bones in edit mode to match the scan. Make sure you have the Rigify add-on enabled for this part. Typically, the meta rig bones are only used as an in-between step to create a much nicer rig, but in this case, we actually just want the meta rig for our ragdoll physics. And we'll use automatic weights to bind the model to the meta rig. Now we're set up and ready to use the Ragdoll tools, but before we do, I want to thank today's sponsor. You may have noticed that we've been playing music that you've likely heard before and without getting a copyright claim, and that is thanks to today's sponsor, LUTs. Up until now, we've all been excluded from using chart music, meaning popular and trending songs, because you will of course get hit with copyright strikes and all the bad things that come along with that. Well, with LUTs, you can license these songs per track, and having worked with licensed popular music in the past, the cost of their tracks is pretty insane, to the point that I'm not really sure how they're doing this. It's even cheaper if your video is not sponsored, but even if your video is sponsored, like all of ours are, it's insanely low cost for what it is. And as we searched through their library, I was shocked at the types of tracks that we were finding, like this one. Or this one.
Cut my life into pieces. This is my last resort. Suffocation, no breathing. Don't give a f if I cut my arm bleeding. This is my last resort.
One thing I love about this is the level of production value that it gives your project. This isn't just good music, it's recognizable music. And just like getting a known actor for your film, it adds a perceived value to your video that gives it a much bigger feel for your audience. And their goal is to sign all major record labels and publishers so that you will eventually be able to get anything at all that you want, making commercial music available to everyone. Now, while they've been pay per track up until now, they are also adding solid subscription-based stock music library as well, so it's definitely becoming a one-stop shop sort of place. Of course, the licenses are available for YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. It's a one-use video license that covers you in all the permitted platforms, so definitely check that out in the notes below to see all that they have to offer.
Logo.
Getting back to it, we have our scans set so we can start using the Ragdoll Tool plugin. This is a third-party plugin that can be found on the Blender Market website. It basically automates the process of setting up ragdolls in Blender. The first thing that we're going to do here is select both the mesh and the meta rig and use the plugin to generate hitboxes for each bone. After that, we'll select the hitboxes and use the plugin again to create constraints. These basically connect the hitboxes together and act like hinges. You can use the set limits mode to easily see the rotation angles on each constraint and adjust them to whatever makes sense for your rig. Now you can tweak the values manually, or you can clear the limits by hitting C on your keyboard and pose each bone to set the constraints. And now with it all set up, we could test it out. And of course, the best way to test it would be
You have to say it.
I don't have to say it.
Why are you
I shouldn't
pointing at the
say it.
screen like that?
Because it's like, it's a presenting.
What are you on Wheel of Fortune?
They don't do that on Wheel of
You have
Fortune.
to say it anyways. We can't just show it.
We don't have to say, we're not using the effects. So would it
Do
make,
you want to show it?
yes,
Then
but how would
say
it
it.
make more sense?
Say it.
I'm not using the effect.
Say it.
Turbulent displace.
Turbulent displacement, turbulent displacement, turbulent displacement when I'm curving on your face, man. Turbulent displacement, turbulent displacement, turbulent displacement when I'm curving on your face, man.
It's not a rule. It makes no sense
It
to
is
say
the
it if
rule.
I'm not
It's
using
the
the
thing
effect.
that we've set up.
There is no rule. We
can't
just always cut to it. Yes, we
Why are we
can.
even still
We
arguing
cut to
about
it because
this?
we're using
It
the effect.
doesn't
That's the
make
whole.
any sense.
Now we'll start setting up our footage and create the background plate. In After Effects, we're going to import our footage and find a good cutting point between the take with Josh and the take without. We're going to make this cut as seamless as possible by animating the position of the second plate to match more closely to the first one using Motion Tile plugin to extend the edges. We'll also want to rotoscope the car and animate it so it looks like it's hitting Josh. We can adjust this later once we've finished our 3D as well. And now that we have all that in place, we can render this comp and use it as our plate when working in Blender. Back in Blender, we're gonna make a new file and import the render into motion tracking panel. Our shot has a lot of motion blur, so we'll need to track some parts by hand, but it really isn't that hard. There's some bright reflections in the shot that give us something to latch onto during the camera pan, so as long as we place our trackers in the middle of these light streaks, the camera solver should be able to give us something to work with. Also, for nodal panning shots like this, you don't need as many tracks as you normally would for a moving camera. On some frames, we only had 2 trackers and it still managed to solve the motion just fine. You should also enter the sensor size and focal length if you know what those values are. Once the camera motion is solved, we'll set our footage as the background and head back to 3D Workspace to align our camera. We'll put a camera solver constraint on our camera object and move it so that our background plate lines up with the grid. It helps to create a meta rig just to get a sense of scale in the scene. Our track ended up slanting at the start for some reason, but luckily that won't be a problem for this shot. We'll set up some scene geometry for the ground and the buildings, as well as set up the sunlight and the world texture to get the lighting to match. Next, we'll append the ragdoll we made earlier, making sure we're importing the collection for the mesh, the hitboxes, and the constraints. Since we made the ragdoll in another file, we'll need to make sure that the constraints collection is set in the rigid body tab in the scene settings. Otherwise, the hitboxes will just explode and not be linked. Also, be sure to set the ground and walls as passive rigid body objects so the ragdoll collides with them. And at this point, we need to pose the ragdoll. Currently, our rig is still following the hitboxes, so we'll use the Ragdoll Tool plugin to tell the rig to follow the bones instead. We'll line up the 3D Josh to match the last frame of the real Josh as closely as possible, and once he's properly posed, we'll snap the constraints to the new pose and tell the bones to follow the hitboxes again. Now we'll need to animate a stand-in object for the car to propel Josh toward the wall. This can basically just be a cube object. From here, it's all about tweaking the simulation. The exact speed and timing of when our car hits the ragdoll will have a huge effect on how the simulation turns out. If your simulation is unstable, try increasing the rigid body, sub-steps, and solver iterations. For us, somewhere around 200 steps and 50 solver iterations seem to work fine. Then from here, it's all about tweaking things over and over until the simulation looks right. In our shot, we used a combination of the car object and wind force to get the right motion. Once you're happy with the simulation, it's a good idea to bake the physics simulation so that everything is locked in. The last thing that we're going to do in Blender is create a dented version of the garage door, so we'll make a model that matches the details of the door as closely as possible, subdivide it, and use sculpting to model a dent where Josh hits the door. From here, we'll set our scene geometry objects as shadow catchers and start setting up our view layers for our render pass. We'll render Josh, the shadow pass, and the door as separate layers. Back in After Effects, we're going to import our renders and start compositing. We'll use an exposure effect on our beauty pass to match the contrast of our footage, and a lumetri effect to adjust the color temperature and skin tones more closely. We'll set the shadow pass to multiply and fill it with a color that matches the other shadows in the scene. It's helpful to use the exposure control in the viewport to see how the shadows and black levels are matching to the ground plate. Now, instead of retracking our shot in After Effects, we can export our 3D camera that we tracked in Blender as a JSX file. You'll need to install a free add-on to do this, which we'll link in the description below. With that data, we can easily track in some blood and dust elements that really help glue all this together. The elements that we're using here, we got again from our friends at Action VFX. Now, the last thing we need to do is recreate the lens flare and overlay them on top of the CG elements. We'll create a black solid and rotoscope each element of the flare and set the color of each mask using solid composite effects. Now, instead of duplicating our flare and matting it for each part of the render, we'll create a combined alpha matte for all of our CG elements. A good way to do this is to make a new solid and add a set matte effect for each element that needs the flares composited on top. Set all of them to be inverted and invert the alpha at the end to get a proper combined matte. Now we can use this layer as a matte for the lens flares, keeping in mind that you'll need to pre-compose your blood elements and anything that isn't the same size as the composition. The final thing to do is add in all of our sound to tie it all together, and we have... Okay, break! You have Josh getting f***ed up by a car. Okay, break! Which is my favorite.
You should see a therapist.
So if you ever wanted to hit your friends with a car safely, there you go. As always, if you aren't subscribed, consider doing that and hit the bell to be notified when we put up new content. And until next time, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat. Hit Josh with a car. Repeat.
Cut my life into pieces. This is my last resort. Suffocation, no breathing. Don't give a f if I cut my own